Humans are an incredibly diverse species, and minorities are the majority, I think.
The Change Podcast. Everything changes, everything stays the same.
Why does everything keep on changing?
Hello, welcome back to the Change Podcast.
Episode 4, I think, this time.
Yeah, that's starting to add up quickly. We've finally gotten our crap together and pulling some recordings together.
If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see in the background we're in Lake Conjola on our annual sunny summer holiday. Beautiful spot.
Yeah, and we weren't going to record down here due to the difficulties of outdoor recording, lots of background noise, and people having fun and squealing all around us. So I hope you will have some patience with the audio quality. May not be as good on this one, but we're going to do our best.
The vision will be more interesting. Right now, we've got a boat going past us in the background, for example. So,
yeah, so this might be one for YouTube viewing pleasure. Yeah, so just to quickly introduce ourselves, my name is Jem Clifton. I'm a PhD psychology student and an early transition trans woman. And who's my father?
I'm Shane Clifton. I'm associate with the Centre for Disability Research and Policy at the University of Sydney, professor in theology and ethics, and the focus of my work has been on disability studies, but actually I've also done quite a bit of work with students on LGBTQI issues as well, and certainly acceptance and inclusion of LGBTQI people in the church and in the general community. And I guess this podcast is also a reflection of some of that background work I've done as well. So,
yeah, and there's a lot of underlying symmetries among all minority experiences, I guess, of oppression and challenge. But yeah, so the reason we have decided to whip out all of the technology in our nature retreat is that over the last week since our last recording, I have had a few breakthroughs in my understanding of where some of my psychological baggage around transitioning comes from, and I've worked through some of those issues. So I thought it might be interesting to unpack some of that on this.
It's interesting
fresh.
Choice of term there, baggage, but maybe that wouldn't be the term that I'd use. But certainly the last podcast reflected some of the challenges that you've had some more thought on. So
yeah, no, I think baggage is actually a really good term because it's definitely a load of stuff that I've had to carry that I didn't need to, that was given to me by other people, and not anyone in particular. I guess the ethereal term society will probably come up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we get there, it has been a week or so then, Jem. Has there been any further physical changes you want to talk about, or in that time basically not much happens?
Yeah, nothing significant over the last week. Although my breasts are coming in more, that's very exciting. I spend a lot of my days looking down at my chest. They've gotten to the stage where if I'm wearing a t-shirt, my chest certainly doesn't look masculine anymore. I'm kind of in the weird in-between stage that I guess a lot of pubescent girls go through. And with that, I'm learning to adjust to my new spatial dimensions. I'm often accidentally hitting myself, and that's quite painful. Otherwise, yeah, the main thing I've been doing in the last week was I got my 2-month blood test to test my hormone levels, and that way I can see my doctor on Monday, and we can titrate my dose to optimize, I guess, like my hormone levels to be within the average female range. That's kind of a lot of what the process is. We've chatted about my goals for transition, and I was a bit unsure what that really meant, because I thought this was a see what you get kind of journey. And the doctors just said, well, what would you like to see in 3 months? And my answer was, I guess I'd love to have to wear a bra in 3 months. That would be a good measure of breast growth.
And she thought that was potentially achievable?
Yeah,
It
she
seems
thought that was
pretty
a great
quick to
goal.
me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I will get the majority of my breast growth in the first year. So by 3 months from now, I'd be at 5 months. So that would be, yeah. She seemed to think it was reasonable,
Okay.
but we will see what happens. Yeah.
Well, then let's turn our attention to some of your reflections for this week. And yeah, I guess you certainly seem a little more positive, or positive is the wrong word, but have more insight into your own challenges. So you lead the conversation.
All right. Yeah, no, I think positive is a great word. I'm feeling a lot more positive, a lot more empowered in facing the challenges that I'm facing, and a lot more valid in my experience. And I guess the trigger for that has been I've been reading a delightful autobiography that my mum bought me. I guess it's more of a memoir than an autobiography because it's not a whole life, but the memoir of a trans masculine person from Melbourne who is an academic historian, and they decided to transition.
Have you got the name of the book for
30s.
anyone who's interested in that?
I do. So the book is called All About Eve. It's by Eve Rees. Yeah, the book is right here. Unfortunately, I am not very good with my French pronunciation. I've been reading the book and I haven't heard them pronounce their name. So I've worked out that it sounds somewhat like Eve, but maybe slightly different with an accent.
But in French, it's a male masculine name. Yeah.
In French, it's a masculine name.
Yves Rees.
Yeah. And yeah, that's been a really incredible read for me because I guess I never realized how similar the experience of trans people could be, and listening to someone else's experience has been very affirming for me, particularly I guess that initially their experience was of trying to work out whether, because they didn't feel totally female, and like they never fit into the female category throughout their life, although they were assigned female at birth, and yet they still tried their hardest to approximate femininity and to fit in socially. And then when their egg cracked, as it's referred to in trans communities, when they realized that they were trans, then they kind of, I guess, faced that question of, okay, so I'm trans, does that mean I should be pushing all the way into the other category of the binary? And that didn't sit well for them either, for their own personal reasons. They didn't feel like they completely fit into the male category, and so they refer to themselves as transmasculine, and I guess group themselves in the gender non-binary community and use they/them pronouns in the singular sense. And in the early chapters, I guess they were trying to explore the confusion around existing in the gap between two categories and not really having a direct answer for exactly where they were to start off with. And I very much resonated with that, because there is a difficulty in knowing all of your life that you didn't fit into the male category. Well, for me, that I didn't fit into the male category. And yet I was still socialized male, and I still tried my hardest to be male. And so now I'm in this position where I am transitioning to female, and yet I have all of these habits and residual masculine traits that I am learning how to shed, and I won't ever be able to go back in time and regain my socializing experience. So I won't have the feminine experience of socializing, and I probably won't ever perfectly fit into the female category. And so myself also, I will exist in the gap. And there's some beauty in that. And she quoted a German poet, Reichel, I think their name was. I should have written this down so I could have quoted it, but it is a beautiful little bit of prose where he talks about how in life we often have a lot of questions that are not unanswerable immediately. So that are unanswerable immediately, and that until we find the answer, while we might not feel like we can live without the answer, we need to be able to live in the question. We need to be able to live fully in the question. And so that was really freeing for me, I guess, reflecting on the understanding that I could live in doubt and in uncertainty for a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because that uncertainty includes an uncertainty as to exactly what type of woman you can become. I was really interesting because I was talking to a friend yesterday, Phil, at camp. We were talking about your transition, and one of the contributions I think trans people bring to the world is causing us all to question and to think about those gendered norms that we take as a given, that we take as natural, and that we all socialize ourselves into, because of course none of us fit perfectly within those categories and can all benefit from questioning the extent to which those categories have bound us and socialized us and constrained us. So it's certainly one of the fascinating things that I can reflect about as a very typical Australian man who hadn't had to think much about those categories. So it's been a fascinating journey for me. So thank you for taking me on it.
Yeah, it is definitely interesting to look on how gender categories can restrict us in a lot of ways. Yeah, and so also I guess for me in my journey, I'm learning what it means to be a woman, and I guess the funny thing about that is that no matter how many physical changes I go through, none of them are in any way determining of womanhood. You know, there's women who have had mastectomies or who just didn't grow large breasts at all. So breasts are definitely not the measure of woman. My soft skin certainly isn't the measure of woman, although estrogen does produce that. And I guess my question that the answer that I'm leaning towards in the interim of fully understanding myself as a woman is that to be a woman is to feel empowered in your own womanhood, whatever that means for you. And that's a very subjective feeling, and one that you can constantly cultivate within yourself. It's kind of just being loving towards yourself and loving all of your aspects and your nature, and you know, supporting yourself and yeah, I guess embodying self-confidence. But yeah, so
because we were talking about this book, and then the other thing that this book got you thinking about was some of your own or it really got you help to understand some of the reasons you were facing such a challenge last time we spoke.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the baggage.
Yeah.
That I was referring to. So yeah, last time we spoke in the second episode when we were last reflecting on my challenges, the challenges that I've been facing have been in feeling valid as a trans person and in also being able to feel lovable and confident in my trans identity and feel like I am a normal human who isn't broken and can exist in society and be loved. And so there was a brilliant chapter in this book on trans representation in the media that really helped me break through this. And it's interesting because it's not even the first time that I've reflected on trans representation in the media. Just to, I guess, provide a resource before I dive into some of this stuff for people who are interested in further learning. There is a really amazing documentary on Netflix called Disclosure that it just goes through all trans representation historically in TV and news. It dates back to, I think, the 1910, the first decade of the 20th century, is kind of when these tropes around trans people in the media began. And so the most pressing example for myself growing up, and anyone from my generation will probably resonate with this, would be Ace Ventura, which I love Jim Carrey. I love over-the-top slapstick humor. It's just like pure silliness. But
it's interesting because when Jem brought that movie up and said it to me, I couldn't think of the relationship between that movie and trans until she specifically explained it, and I thought, of course. So it's interesting. You're not even aware sometimes of when trans tropes are a big part of culture because maybe it's just normalized. But
and it's not something that I'd ever reflected on until it was made very direct to me as well.
So you better tell people what the trans part of that film is.
Yeah, so in the first one, Pet Detective, the climax of the movie is actually the reveal that the villain is trans, or the villain, the criminal, whatever, the
one who stole the dolphin.
Yeah, the dolphin criminal.
The dolphin thief.
That's right. Is the reveal that she is trans, and it's presented as a punchline, and also as something to be disgusted by.
They're
Jim
all standing
Carrey's
around this sort of.
Oh no, that's later on. The first reveal is when Ace Ventura puts together the actual all of the facts and realizes that Einhorn is a man, which he proclaims in disgust, and then there's this whole number of minutes scene of him bathing and vomiting and plunging his face with a toilet plunger, and it's all so incredibly over the top. But the whole joke is that trans people are disgusting and they're not valid and they're not normal. There's something to be revolted by. And then later on also, so what Dad was saying is that at the end, when they finally do catch Einhorn and Jim Carrey is trying to prove to everyone that Einhorn is a man, so initially he rips off her shirt to try and show that she doesn't have real boobs, and of course she has breast augmentation, and then he rips off her skirt, and it looks like she doesn't have a penis, and so there's still a bit of doubt, and it's this progressive revealing of all of her genitals, which is incredibly disrespectful as well. And then finally someone standing behind Einhorn indicates to Ace Ventura that he should turn her around, and he turns her around and the camera pans to her bottom and there's a tucked penis there. And then the whole crowd goes and spits because all of them have kissed her, and it would be the most revolting thing to have kissed a trans woman. And so
what do you say? This is just sort of, I know this is a tangent because and this is a horrible extreme example, but what would you say to people who say, you guys are just being woke here, this is just comedy, and you've just got to relax a bit?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good thing to bring up, and I just want to quickly note when you say it's an extreme example of this, it's actually not. It's actually a very common example. There's also the same thing was done in Family Guy, in The Hangover Part 2, both movies
Much more modern,
that were
recent
out
too.
modern, yeah, and in all cases, the trans person is a joke, and people react with supreme disgust.
Yeah.
But to respond to the wokeness comment, and I guess to, people would obviously argue that comedy should be free to make jokes of any kind. The problem with trans representation is that statistically, only 1 in 10 Australians actually knows or has direct contact with a trans person. And that means that, 80 to 90% of Australians are walking around with genuinely no idea of what it means to be trans, of having no contact with trans people. How could you possibly empathize with them as being human?
Yeah.
And so given that this representation, media representation, is the only exposure people have to trans people, it kind of does instill this perspective within people that being trans is revolting and unnormal.
Look, a joke that works on disgust says something about the person who's making the joke and the community that's laughing about it. In other words, us. And if you just twist that for a second and say, imagine if we made the same joke about black people or women, we've got to be smarter in our humour. So jokes that play into, if you were to make a joke, for example, that made some universal assumption about the intelligence of a particular race or a particular, it just wouldn't be funny because we'd all be horrified by the joke. And that should be the case here. We shouldn't find jokes that play on the disgust or that play on the non-humanity of trans people to be funny. They should horrify us.
Yeah, and it's also playing into this model of cis normativity, which is the assumption that the normal and natural human is cisgendered. And that assumption...
By the way, what is cis? You better just...
Yep. So cis is referring to... Or trans is to move over a divide. And cis is to... I don't know the precise definition, but cisgendered means you are the same gender as your sex.
Right. Is that Latin or something? We should know this. We'll find out for one of our next podcasts for you.
Yeah, it's something I have read about this a lot, but I guess not all the information is retained. But yeah, so cis normativity referring to the normativity of being cisgendered, and it is the assumption that it's normal or natural for humans to be cisgender, and that assumption is obviously false because trans people do and have always existed, and by holding that assumption, you are making the claim that it is not natural to be trans.
I did have someone ask me the other day, well, no, that's, trans is new because we've only recently had hormones and the ability to, make bodily changes, etc.
Well, that's also a misunderstanding because we've been at the first surgical reassignment of gender was done back in the 1920s. So it's been at least 100 years since we've had surgery. But yeah, you're right. Medical transition has only existed for a short amount of time. But trans doesn't mean to medically transition. Trans means to not feel like your gender matches your assigned sex. And people throughout all of human history have navigated that divide by presenting as the opposite gender.
Sometimes recognized as spiritual as a consequence, or shamans, and we've you'll have heard language like cross-dressing. So this is ubiquitous in culture, and maybe there's a conversation for another podcast. But let's come back then to media representation and discussed. Is there any other examples you wanted to talk about? I know one that was significant to us was Silence of the Lambs, because that was a book we both loved, for example.
Yeah. So when trans people aren't being presented as a joke, they are being presented often as victims or as sexual perpetrators. So one of the most common tropes for trans women particularly is that they are men who are trying to lure women into feeling safe so that they can take advantage of them. So the underlying idea is that trans women are sexual predators, which is a horrible assumption again. And it's, I mean,
you see this in the end of, well, I don't want to give away books, but it's a major theme in Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
And even, it's interestingly enough, and we won't go into J.K. Rowling as a whole, but everyone probably knows J.K. Rowling has pretty publicly taken an anti-trans position, and a book she wrote under a pseudonym, Robert Galbraith, for the Cormoran Strike series, which again I love, really great books, but there is one of those whole books which bases around a cross-dressing serial killer. So yeah, it is a common trope, and it actually gets into public policy, this one, doesn't it? Because it's the whole bathroom wars that's become apparent in America. The idea that we have to keep trans women out of female bathrooms because they're likely to, perpetrate some horror, when the reality is not that trans women are more likely to be perpetrators of some sort of abuse, but actually we know that as a whole, trans women are more likely to be subject to abuse.
Yeah. And yeah, it really is, I guess these tropes have such a detrimental effect on the public understanding of trans as well, largely because it's not balanced with positive representations or representations of their humanity in the media. So yeah, it is very hard, by and large, a negative representation that trans people have had in the media. But I'd love to just move into how that has affected my psychology.
Yeah, because we were talking last week about your sense of feeling unlovable, invalid, etc.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing is that I watched Ace Ventura countless times as a kid, and I never reflected on how, I guess, the meaning and how that was affecting my mind until I was suddenly faced with accepting my transness. And I've always known that I'm trans, but I've been strongly denying it. And I guess part of that is because children are very savvy little creatures who will do anything to, I guess, maintain their own survival. And given how trans people were represented to me as a child, it kind of became something that to be trans was a fate worse than death. And so then, of course, I denied my true nature because I was a self-respecting person who wanted to be loved by people and didn't want to be a mockery, wanted to be natural and normal. And I was denied the understanding that it is a natural occurrence among humanity for people to exist that don't feel like they fit into their gender roles or want to sexually transition, because humans are an incredibly diverse species, and minorities are the majority, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so
yeah. I can see how that kind of affected your background and your childhood. How has that affected you in the last few weeks?
Well, this is something that I never actually addressed. So I was instilled with this cis normativity that affected me my whole life and really held me back from transitioning. And then when I did start transitioning, it was coming up very strongly for me because I was suddenly doing exactly the thing that I had subconsciously believed would make me unlovable and not beautiful. And so, over the last week, like realizing that has helped me understanding where a maladaptive belief stems from can be really powerful in letting it go and overcoming it. And it's really empowered me into facing this media societal representation of trans people because it's bogus and I want to stand up for the change. And so, I want to present an example of a trans woman who's normal and natural and healthy and beautiful and intelligent and, can get along with people and can be empathized with as human and is, I guess, worthy of taking up space in the human story. So that's one of the things that comes into my feelings of beauty and normalness and the feeling of being broken, which I mentioned as well. I'm not broken. It's just our representation of trans people that's broken. But then I guess in terms of the feelings of validity, another realization I had was that when I first started coming out to people, one response that I got often was, "Oh, but you're so masculine," and not to point out anyone in particular, I can't quite remember who did it. I just remember the messages and not to criticize either. It's an understandable response of surprise, but I guess the implicit message in that and something that I did feel about myself also internally was that if I was really trans, then surely from when I was a child, I would have rejected all things masculine and I would have been far more obviously girly. And because I lived my life as a male up until very recently, I have felt that I have been invalid as a trans person and that it's, I guess I've been facing the fear that maybe this is actually the mask that I'm putting on to avoid something else.
Right.
And in realizing that, I guess it's the power of seeing positive trans stories that has helped me address this. So in reading this biography and also in seeing many examples of trans people on Instagram and Reddit who have transitioned from being the most masculine men, often like very buff army boys or the prime examples of male into very beautiful girly women at the age of 26 or older or younger, and the same in reverse. Seeing examples of that has helped me realize that it is actually normal for people to live their whole life as one way because they felt they needed to be accepted, and then to suddenly realize that authenticity is more powerful and important than that, and to transform.
Yeah. There's jet skis in the background if that's affecting our sound, so we'll keep going. But look, it's interesting. I guess there's two ways to respond to that feeling of authenticity, and one is to embrace masculinity, in your case even more. And so there's same stories. Often gay people who feel that socially being gay is inappropriate might respond by a sort of representing themselves as hyper straight, or and then later on, as they become more confident with being gay, they're able to let that go. So there's different ways in which people respond. Some do respond by resisting the whole time and being girly and presenting girly, but that wasn't your particular journey or way.
Yeah, and honestly, looking back, if it was my way, it would have been a very difficult way at the time. And thankfully, for the next generation coming in, the narrative is starting to change, and there are so many more cases of beautiful trans people and authenticity that, whatever your true inner authentic self is, hopefully in the future it's a bit easier for people to recognize their beauty, and
well, and again, that's irrespective of trans or not. That's you might not be trans, but you might be a man, a boy who presents more feminine, or the other way around. You might be a girl who's a tomboy, and once upon a time, the tomboy was an insult, and that no longer has to be an insult. And you might be a tomboy, and that doesn't mean you have to later on transition. So it actually, to allow to just be more accepting of diversity and more open in our categories, hopefully society can become more healthy as we start to become a more accepting of society.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I'd love to just also address, it's not all roses and butterflies. It's not like there was a magazine in 2014 that was released with the beautiful Laverne Cox, who, if you're not familiar with her, was a trans woman who had her rise to fame on the hit sitcom Orange is the New Black. And she was one of the first examples that I'm aware of a trans woman who was portrayed in a story as relatively normal. Like, they didn't make a massive deal of it being outrageous. They just presented her story and moved on with that. And she's an integral part of the female prison that people love and get along with. But so this headline was the trans tipping point, and while it was a big tipping point for trans representation in the media, finally we're starting to be presented as in a positive light. The problem is that visibility not only comes with more acceptance, but it also makes it easier for predators to prey on people. And so one of the downsides of that is that since 2014, trans violence has actually increased every single year. Even from 2019 to 2020, there was more examples of trans violence and trans people being killed in the street. So there is also, while trans acceptance is increasing, transphobia is also rearing its head as people, I guess, address this issue of can trans people fit into the societal structure that we have?
Yeah.
And so, if we can all be aware of this, then we can all be allies.
Trans has become a political issue that's divided along the right and the left, and it's really distressing, and it makes it hard to even speak publicly in this space. At times I've had some anxiety about having public conversations about these things because that political space is so vicious and ugly and divided, and I really don't want to enter into this right left woke unwoke conversation, because it is such an awful space publicly to be involved with. But I hope at least some of our conversations can just step back from the politics, although it's all political and social. I'm not saying that all those things are unimportant, but to recognize that what we're talking about here is not a political issue, but human lives and human acceptance and human stories.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, part of while this podcast is political and scary, it's also amazing to have the opportunity to be the trans person that 1 in 10 Australians know, hopefully to increase that number. I've had a few people reach out to me since releasing the podcast, thanking me for sharing my experience because in the past they've tried to connect with LGBT people and have had difficulty understanding. And I guess a lot of trans people in that, a lot of LGBT people in that context are not necessarily willing to constantly have to make people understand them because that's exhausting. And, certainly myself included, I don't want to have to explain to every single person who I meet why I'm doing this, what my reasons are. I enjoy talking about it. And if you do have questions and I'm with you in person, feel free to ask, and it's my responsibility to assert my boundaries if I'm feeling uncomfortable and I don't necessarily want to talk about it, depending on the question you've asked. But yeah, if you ask me in an open way, hey, are you happy to talk about this? I can say yes or no. And but this saves me from having
to have all those
400 conversations.
Yep.
And so that's really helpful. And hopefully with time, we can all come to acknowledge the humanity in the trans experience. And to summarize my revelation this week, it's just that I've always known I'm trans and I'm really excited to transform, and I'm dealing with the baggage that society has lent me of being not normal and unhealthy. And knowing that now, I can face that, and I'm seeing the beauty in transforming, and so much, that while there is also beauty in just having been who you are all along, there's so many more lessons in transforming and so many more experiences that we can have in and growth in stepping from one state into another.
Very good.
Yeah.
I should say, Jem, normality is overrated.
Yeah, my dad always used to call me a weirdo whack job, was his nickname for me.
I did. The ultimate compliment.
I love it.
All right. Peace.
Yes.
Great
Thanks
to
for
talk to you all.
listening again.
Until next time.
Yeah, hopefully the sound quality is good.
Cheers.
See yous.
The Change Podcast. Everything changes, everything stays the